Welcome to Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning for Thursday, October 27th. I'm your host, Tom Orr. The Penn State game is in 2 days, the game against Michigan in 30 days. We are talking scheme this morning, and when we do that, that means it's time for Buckeye Huddle's X's and O's guru, Ross Fulton. He joins me this morning, and Ross, be honest, how much fun did you have going back and watching that Iowa offense for a second time to write your column this week?
You asked the very astute question of Kevin Wilson and Jim Knowles about how they game plan. I think Kevin Wilson said something like, "I watched the tape very quickly on Sunday night." That was basically my approach to rewatching the Ohio State defense versus the Iowa offense.
Frankly, I don't really want to talk much about that Iowa game because the Buckeyes stopping that Iowa offense is kind of like what did we learn? I feel like we learned that Iowa's offense continues to not be very good, and Ohio State's defense can stop a not very good offense. So. What did we learn? I think the fellows went out and got some fresh air and exercise, and that's about all we can take away from last week's game. I did, however, want to talk about Ohio State's struggles with running the ball against Iowa. Yeah. They finished with 66 yards on 30 carries. That is 2.2 yards per rush. Not great. And a long of 13, also not great. So what the heck was Iowa doing to hold the Ohio State rushing attack down that much?
Yeah, so, here's where all the ineptitude of the Iowa offense sort of bleeds over into the perception of Iowa, right? So, Iowa is the number one defense per SP+. And, people will then throw, they play Big Ten teams, and Big Ten doesn't have good offense. But, conversely, look at the situations that Iowa's offense puts that defense in. So, if anything, that they're having to play defense in the most difficult situations possible, and they're so good. So, I probably myself didn't take Iowa seriously enough as a unit. They're very impressive on film. It's how are they always even on those Mitch Rossi last touchdown, they don't bite on things. They are always in the right position. They're very fundamentally sound. So you do have to give them some credit for being a good defense. But as I talked about in my article, they also threw a curveball at Ohio State. I think Ryan Day, cited a stat this week that they were 80 to 90% quarters or cover four, on film. And against Ohio State, they probably played, this is just sort of off the top of my head, but at least over 60% of the snaps were single high or no high. They played a bunch of cover zero with no one deep, especially in all those short yardage and goal line situations. So that obviously takes some getting used to. I know people don't like to hear that the problem was we had a bunch of good field position and that made it harder to adjust. But I do think, as Kevin Wilson pointed out, don't complain about the field position, but it does make you sort of as a coach be well, are they doing this because their back's up against the wall every time and this is their goal line red zone plan, or is this just their overall approach? And so, but long story short, they outnumbered the Ohio State run game. If most in standard downs, first and 10, they generally would play single high and bring a safety down or blitz off the edge, and they'd have 7 defenders for 6 blockers. And then in short yardage, they play cover zero and they'd have 8 blockers or 8 defenders for 6 blockers. And so, as we've talked about in the past, that hasn't been as big of a problem this year, but it doesn't matter how good you are running the football. Unless you're involving the quarterback in the run game, or your running back is Barry Sanders and can make people miss in the backfield, it's going to be difficult.
Well, unless C.J. Stroud starts running the ball a lot more, or they can somehow find Barry Sanders some extra eligibility, how big of a concern is that moving forward? And I guess let me phrase this way. Is the Iowa plan to slow the Ohio State running game down something that you think Penn State could try to emulate, or Michigan in a couple weeks? And I guess more importantly, is it something that they would actually have the personnel and coordinators to pull off if they do?
Yeah, so, and I don't think either thing's going to happen. I don't think people should count on C.J. Stroud suddenly becoming a running quarterback. It's not who he is. It's not his strengths. Don't make someone do something that they aren't. And so, it's a concern in the sense of, it's a concern if you continue to run into stacked boxes without any sort of response to it, then that's a problem. The good thing for Ohio State is what's the response when you don't have a running quarterback to being outnumbered? It's you throw the football. The good news for Ohio State is that they are the best passing offense in the country. So, you would think you'd want to throw the football plenty anyways. And they picked up on it. We saw those several 4th down conversions where they sprinted out Stroud left to set up those easy throws to Harrison. It cuts into the the rushing statistics. But I guess if teams want to play you that way, then you have to respond. I mean, there's basically two things you can do. You can continue to bring bodies in. So we've seen Ohio State do that near the goal line. They continued even against Iowa in the low red zone, inside the 10 to be successful. So, you can get double or triple tights and I formation, and that just, it reduces the effectiveness of bringing someone off the edge because they just have to come from farther away. Or, you throw the football. And so, I think we'll see some of both. I mean, this kind of is what Michigan did to Ohio State last year. We talked about that, hey, we see pistol, we're spinning down and we're going to bring 5 and we're going to play, cover 3 behind it. And Manny Diaz, we can talk about the Penn State rush defense, but he loves to fire his zone as well. So I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, we've sort of seen teams try to take one of two approaches to Ohio State. They either get super aggressive, that's what Iowa did, that's what Rutgers did for that quarter we talked about, or they try to play super conservative and sit in a shell. I would expect more of the aggressive approach just because you try to get take away the run. You're at least, if you're taking away the run game, you're at least taking away something. And then maybe, you have to get pressure on Stroud or else he's just going to pick you apart if he's comfortable. So you have to make him uncomfortable and get off your spot. So I would expect more of it. I don't think, though, that Ohio State should be caught by surprise going forward if they see something similar.
Well, it seemed like Stroud was uncomfortable a decent amount on Saturday against Iowa, and there were some pass pro issues which you hadn't necessarily seen a ton of earlier in the year, but you had the strip sack for the touchdown very early in the game. Did that game change what you view as the most likely ceiling for this offense in terms of, if they can't rush, then the pass pro becomes, and they can't pass protect, then that limits the ceiling? Or is this just one of those, you don't want to overreact to one game because now Ohio State has a chance to come up with a counterpunch and you got to kind of see what they do in terms of a counterpunch?
Yeah, much more the latter. And I mean, we already saw some of that counterpunch in the second half, right? And so, I know people, that sort of leaves people wanting because it would, so what about the first half? And, can't go back in time and fix things. But, they made sure that they protected better in the second half. They used more 6 and 7 man protection schemes. It's well, if you want to be aggressive and man us up on the outside, we'll make sure we have plenty of time to throw, and our wide receivers will beat you in coverage if we give enough time. So, those are some of the responses you'll see. I think run game wise, I think it's stuff we've talked about. It's continued to diversify the approach. So it's the opponent isn't oh, well, here comes Cade Stover in motion from the boundary. Here comes stretch split zone to the short field. So they use, I showed my article, they used a new play for the first time. They used what's called a pin and pull sweep. So the unblocked lineman pull and the covered lineman block down. And, to the same side as the halfback. So again, you're breaking tendencies of running to the halfback side. And so we are sort of gradually seeing some of the influence of probably Justin Fry via Chip Kelly, who's had dealt with these issues in the NFL. And so he, in terms of tendencies. And so he's probably has, worked off of that. And so I do think some of those things will help, but what's going to win Ohio State a national championship is their passing game. And so, running the ball is important, but, I've never, as you know, bought into this, it's 3rd and 2, you must run the football to prove that you are a real football team kind of thing. Defenses can always outnumber you, and if they do, throw the football, and that's totally acceptable. First down's a first down.
Well, Penn State did a pretty good job not giving up a lot of 3rd and 2 runs against Michigan a couple weeks ago. That was mostly because Michigan was running for 7.6 yards per carry, so you didn't get to a lot of third downs there, and 418 yards rushing overall. It is not easy to give up 7.6 yards per carry on 30 carries, let alone, Ross, 55 carries at 7.6 per. I literally cannot remember seeing that outside of maybe I think Brian Van Gorder had a real bad day at Louisville against a Paul Johnson Georgia Tech team at one point. But it's there's these real historically anomalous games. And that was what Michigan did to Penn State a couple weeks ago. So you mentioned Manny Diaz's name. Let's talk a little Manny Diaz. Is, 418 yards rushing. Is that a case of Penn State not being a good rushing defense? Is that Michigan being a particularly bad matchup for the Manny Diaz scheme? What do you chalk that up to?
So there's some of both there. Like statistically, they are not a good rush defense, and Michigan, because they are a good rush offense, and a very diverse one, was really able to exploit it. But Manny Diaz is like sort of MO is like, I'm going to be super aggressive and super disguised. You know, I'm gonna run a bunch of like exotic fire zone blitzes. You know, like I'll bring 6 guys and play like 2 deep behind, and like I'll slant really hard. And like I don't care if my defense isn't sound, out of the hope that I'm going to create negative plays. And so, in particular, like what Michigan really exploited, and like, you know, for those of you on Twitter, like I highly recommend Space Coyote's work. He does like a lot of Big Ten stuff. He does a ton of Michigan stuff. But when Michigan runs a ton of gap schemes, so like they'll pull, you know, they'll run power, they'll bring a fullback and pull the guard. They'll run counter tray and bring 2 people. Like when Michigan moved gaps post snap to the other side of the field, like Penn State just did not know how to react. Like their linebackers wouldn't fall back the way they need to, or the safeties wouldn't spin correctly. And they just left themselves open to just getting gashed. Or like, you know, they'd slant so far upfield that the defensive lineman would be out of the play and had no chance to maintain gap integrity. So, you know, to our earlier point, like I'm sure he will try to get Ohio State into negative plays. Ohio State does not have the same type of like diverse, particularly like gap running scheme that Michigan does. Like they will run counter tray. Obviously, we've talked about that. Like they'll run split zone. There's things they can certainly do, and like I hope to see them do that. But you know, again, I think there's going to be opportunities for explosive plays because like they are fundamentally unsound in the way that Manny Diaz approaches defense.
So, I mean, if Ohio State does have another sluggish day on the ground, they don't hit those explosive plays, and it's, you know, I mean, I don't 30 carries for 120 yards, whatever you want, you know, something in that neighborhood, 4.5 yards a carry. It's just kind of another like, yeah, it was okay kind of day, but nothing, you know, not 2.2 again, but you know, nothing spectacular. How big of a red flag would that be to you in terms of the Ohio State rushing offense against, you know, and even maybe competent defense?
I think my first response would be like, why did you run it 30 times then if you're being that, you know, having that meager success? Because I don't know. I think like, you know, another recommended source, like College Football Nerds, they had like, you know, they do yards per play, and that's like their whole model's based on. I think Ohio State's like, I'm off the top of my head, like let's say somewhere between 5 and 6 yards a rush attempt, and they're like over 10 yards a passing attempt, which again, like to me, balance is where those numbers even out. It's not just like how many attempts you do at each, like you do what the defense is giving you. And so, you know, if teams again want to load the box, like they need to be able to throw. I mean, the bigger thing is like, again, ensuring pass protection and like Stroud being comfortable, sometimes stepping up into the rush and not, you know, not having his mechanics break down as much as just like the rushing game. But like, again, Iowa, in terms of like, in Penn State are kind of like the opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of like trying to execute a fundamentally sound defensive scheme. And so I have faith that, you know, I do think that the Ohio State rushing attack will have better success than they did against Iowa. Obviously, you know, we can spend the next like 6 weeks doing this, like how did Michigan do versus like how did Ohio State do in like every aspect, and like playing in Happy Valley and playing in Ann Arbor, you know, for Penn State are 2 very different things. So, you know, just to warn Ohio State fans now, like don't get into that game with comparing the Penn State outcomes. But I do think that, you know, Penn State's a better pass defense than they are a rush defense, at least statistically. So I do think there'll be opportunities on the ground.
And I did want to ask you about that pass defense because, you know, I mean, there is the you know, Manny Diaz in the back of the van, like Charlie Day on It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. You know, I cut the brakes, wild card, you know, with whatever nonsense he's going to throw at him. But, I mean, they have 2 really good corners, too. So is this going to be the biggest challenge the passing game will have faced yet this season? Or is this not as, I mean, am I wrong there?
I mean, I'd still say Iowa. I mean, just statistically, and like, you know, Iowa's corners and their nickel are really good. Like, they were really impressive in man coverage. I mean, agree that Penn State has good corners. I'm not sure they play like a ton of man to man. They, as I said, he loves to like run 5-man, like 5-man fire zones with like cover 2 behind or cover 3 behind. They will they'll like wildly rush up the field, which is a real problem against like running mobile quarterbacks. Obviously with Stroud, that's less of an issue. He just needs to step up in the pocket, but like they're certainly a challenge. I do not think they're as good a defense as Iowa, but they obviously will play better complementary football. So it's also not like Ohio State will be starting every drive on, the Penn State 25-yard line. So I do think that they will be able to slow Ohio State down somewhat relative to their, average of 40 plus points per game. But, I think that Ohio State should be able to have some success.
All right, so you sort of seem to hint there that this Penn State offense might be better than Iowa's offense, which, I mean, we tend not to traffic in hot takes here, but okay, I guess. It does seem like Penn State's offensive line. You can tell me where I'm wrong on all of this. Here's what I'm expecting, and you tell me where I'm wrong. Penn State's offensive line is going to maybe be an issue for them against the Buckeyes' defensive front. They have not been able to run the ball consistently all fall. Like, they've got real talented running backs, but they're young running backs, and they're just kind of not there yet, plus an iffy offensive line. Putting the game on Sean Clifford's shoulders probably is not going to get you to 40 points. The wide receivers and tight end, Brenton Strange, are solid, but they're not incredible. I mean, am I wrong on anything that I just said there? And, Tony Gerdeman and I did a, 80% confidence. What's Penn State? Penn State will not score more than X number of points on offense with like an 80% confidence outside of like some weird fluky stuff. And we both landed on like that 17 to 20 range. Is that kind of where you sort of see this shaking out?
Yeah, I mean, more or less, I guess I will, I see a game that's probably like, Ohio State in the mid 30s and Penn State like in the low 20s, high teens. I agree. Penn State's left tackle is pretty good. The rest of the offensive line is still not very good. And, Ohio State's defense, as we said, like, I'm as you know, a big believer in like, using the advanced statistics for comparison, but like you can definitely do the ain't played nobody with the defense because Ohio State's faced some pretty putrid offenses this year. But that said, like we know Ohio State's defensive line is good, and like that continues to be the key and pressure. I mean, I do have some concerns about breakdowns in the secondary. And there were some breakdowns against Iowa. It's just Iowa never had a chance to get that far because they had multiple Ohio State defenders in their face. I think that the corner situation will continue to be interesting with Jordan Hancock slowly coming back and how they handle that. But so I don't disagree with all of what you're saying. I could see Clifford hit some. I don't think it's going to be like they're totally shutting down Penn State, but I do think Penn State's going to struggle to run the football, and it will largely be upon how well Clifford and their, how well they can pass protect and how well he can throw and, make some plays out of structure, when he's scrambling around.
All right, well, we will have plenty more coverage of that Ohio State-Penn State game, obviously, in the lead up to the game. Pre-game coverage, live post-game coverage from Beaver Stadium after the game. Lots of stuff to talk about. It's this is not probably the single best team Ohio State will face during the regular season, but it might be one of the 2 or maybe 3 best teams Ohio State will face during the regular season. So, and on the road, always a little bit of an interesting test to see how they respond on the road. So, should be an interesting game. You can read Ross's work at BuckeyeHuddle.com. Highly recommend his article. We always, it feels like we do a deep dive on these shows. And then his article is like covering 3 times as much as we talk about here. So make sure you check that out at BuckeyeHuddle.com. Also, just go ahead and join the site. Listen, I mean, I feel like I tell you this every day. You're really going to enjoy it. It's a fun place, great community. And now we are like a month away from the Michigan game. So congratulations. If you haven't joined yet, you've now waited long enough that you join. Give it a try for a month, and your membership will include the day of the Michigan game. How about that? That is going to be quite a month of Ohio State football talk in the lead up to that. Plenty of recruiting coverage from Mark Givler and Alex Gleitman. our fantastic team of X's and O's guys, including Ross and Justin Whitlatch and Devin Radcliffe. Those guys are all killing it on the board, the Huddle board at BuckeyeHuddle.com. Sign up today. And of course, if you're watching on YouTube, youtube.com/BuckeyeHuddle, make sure you are subscribed to that channel. Make sure you hit that bell. We will have tons of pre- and post-game coverage this weekend and for that Penn State game. That'll do it for today. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.